In the spring of 1943, as the world burned in the fires of mechanized warfare, something extraordinary happened on a small island in the Aleutian chain. While tanks rolled across North Africa and bombers darkened European skies, a group of American soldiers would face their enemy not with rifles or grenades, but with cold steel drawn from another age entirely. The Aleutian Islands stretch like a broken spine across the North Pacific, 1,000 miles of volcanic rock, perpetual fog, and winds that can strip flesh from bone. These remote islands, technically part of Alaska, had become an unexpected front in the Second World War when Japanese forces invaded in June 1942, seizing Attu and Kiska Islands. It was the first invasion of American soil since the War of 1812, and though far from the European theater, it represented a direct threat to the North American continent. The battle we examine today stands apart from every other engagement of World War II. It was fought in conditions so extreme that modern weapons failed. It was decided by men wielding blades in hand-to-hand combat that would have been familiar to warriors from centuries past. And it culminated in one of the war's most desperate and haunting charges, where Japanese soldiers, having exhausted every bullet and thrown every grenade, fixed bayonets and katanas for a final assault that would become legend. This is the story of the Battle of Attu, where the ancient and modern collided in the fog and blood of the Aleutian wilderness. Where American troops, unprepared for the brutal reality of close-quarters combat, learned that even in an age of aircraft carriers and atomic research, war could still come down to two men and the sharpness of their blades. Where the last great banzai charge of the Pacific War transformed a forgotten island into a graveyard, and where the line between victory and annihilation grew as thin as a sword's edge. The temperature hovered just above freezing. The wind howled across treeless tundra. And in the killing fog that reduced visibility to mere feet, men prepared to meet each other with weapons that predated gunpowder itself. What happened on Attu would shock commanders, traumatize survivors, and reveal a fundamental truth about warfare that all the technology in the world could not erase. That sometimes, battle returns to its most primal form. The Aleutian campaign had never been part of anyone's grand strategy. For Japan, the invasion of Attu and Kiska in June 1942 served primarily as a diversion during the Battle of Midway, drawing American attention northward while the Imperial Navy attempted to lure the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement. But after Midway ended in catastrophic defeat for Japan, these remote islands became strategic orphans, Japanese garrisons left to endure conditions that made the frozen Eastern Front seem hospitable by comparison. For the United States, the occupied Aleutians represented both a psychological wound and a potential threat. Japanese bombers could theoretically reach the American mainland from these positions. More importantly, the invasion had occurred on American territory, and public pressure demanded their recapture. Yet the islands offered little strategic value, and commanders knew that fighting in the Aleutians would be a logistical nightmare of the highest order. The soldiers assigned to retake Attu came largely from the 7th Infantry Division, trained for desert warfare in preparation for the North African campaign. Instead, they found themselves heading to a landscape so alien it might as well have been another planet. There were no trees on Attu, only tundra and volcanic rock. There were no roads, no structures beyond what the Japanese had built. The temperature rarely rose above 40 degrees Fahrenheit even in May, and the wind blew with such ferocity that men had to crawl on their bellies across open ground or risk being blown off ridges to their deaths. The Japanese garrison on Attu numbered approximately 2,500 men under the command of Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, an officer known for his tactical skill and rigid adherence to the samurai code of Bushido. These troops had spent nearly a year fortifying the island's high ground, digging into the permafrost to create bunkers and tunnel systems that rendered conventional bombardment nearly useless. They were cold, hungry, and increasingly isolated as American submarines made resupply missions suicidal, but they remained disciplined and determined to fight to the last man. American intelligence had severely underestimated the garrison's strength and resolve. The invasion plan, codenamed Operation Landcrab, called for 11,000 troops to overwhelm what commanders believed were fewer than 1,000 defenders. The assault began on May 11, 1943, with troops landing on beaches at the northern and southern ends of the island, planning to converge on the Japanese positions in the central valleys and ridges. But nothing went according to plan. The landing craft struggled through heavy surf. Equipment sank in the muskeg, a boggy tundra that swallowed vehicles and heavy weapons like quicksand. Troops found themselves wading through knee-deep icy water, their clothing soaked, their weapons clogged with mud. And everywhere there was the fog, thick gray curtains that reduced the world to a claustrophobic few yards of visibility. The Japanese defensive positions were masterful. They had placed machine gun nests and mortar positions on the high ground, commanding every approach. As American forces advanced through the valleys, they walked into interlocking fields of fire from enemies they couldn't see. The fog that hindered the attackers aided the defenders, who knew every inch of the terrain. Casualties mounted rapidly. Men fell to bullets fired from invisible positions. Artillery support became nearly impossible in the zero-visibility conditions. As days passed, the fighting devolved into a savage infantry slog. Flamethrowers became crucial weapons for clearing bunkers. Grenades were thrown blindly into the fog. Entire platoons became lost in the featureless terrain, wandering until they stumbled into Japanese positions or froze in place overnight. The cold claimed as many casualties as combat. Trench foot disabled hundreds. Frostbite turned fingers black and useless. Men who fell wounded in exposed positions often died from exposure before they could be evacuated. And always, there was the knowledge among the Japanese defenders that they were fighting a battle they could not win. No reinforcements would come. No evacuation was possible. Their orders were clear: resist to the last man, inflict maximum casualties, and die with honor. As ammunition dwindled and food ran out, Colonel Yamasaki began preparing for what Japanese military doctrine called gyokosai, the shattering of the jewel, a final suicidal attack that would achieve death in battle rather than the unthinkable shame of surrender. By May 28, 1943, the American advance had compressed the Japanese garrison into an ever-shrinking pocket in the mountains above Chichagov Harbor. What had been expected to take 3 days had consumed more than 2 weeks of brutal fighting. American casualties already exceeded 1,000, with hundreds more disabled by cold injuries and psychological trauma. The Japanese had fought with a ferocity that shocked even veteran troops, defending bunkers to the last man, forcing the Americans to kill every defender before securing each position. The terrain had become a nightmare landscape of frozen mud, abandoned equipment, and unburied dead. Supply lines stretched thin as pack mules and human porters struggled to bring ammunition and food to forward positions. Medical evacuation took hours, with wounded men carried on stretchers across miles of trackless tundra. The fog remained constant, turning every movement into a groping advance through gray obscurity where death could come from any direction. Colonel Yamasaki's situation had become untenable. His garrison was down to fewer than 1,000 effective fighters. Ammunition was critically low. Food had run out days earlier. Medical supplies were exhausted, leaving the wounded to suffer without morphine or bandages. Intelligence reports indicated that American forces were preparing a final assault to eliminate the pocket. Yamasaki knew that passive defense was no longer possible. If his men were to die, they would die attacking. In the early hours of May 29, Yamasaki assembled his remaining officers and outlined his plan. They would launch a full-scale banzai charge, a desperate assault designed to break through American lines, capture artillery positions and supply dumps, and die fighting rather than starve in their bunkers. Every able-bodied man would participate. The wounded who could walk would join the attack. Those too injured to move would take their own lives rather than face capture. The Japanese soldiers prepared themselves according to the traditions of Bushido. They wrote final letters to their families, knowing the messages would never be delivered. They burned personal effects. Some donned the thousand-stitch belts their mothers had made for protection in battle. Officers checked their swords, traditional katanas that had been carried through the campaign as symbols of rank and fighting spirit. Enlisted men fixed bayonets and sharpened the blades on stone. And then they waited for darkness. The American positions that night were spread along the line defending Engineer Hill and the approaches to the beach supply dumps. The 7th Infantry Division had established defensive positions, but after weeks of combat, exhaustion had dulled vigilance. Many troops slept in foxholes, wrapped in whatever blankets they could find, trying to generate warmth in the freezing wind. Command posts were minimally guarded, the commanders confident that the compressed Japanese pocket lacked the strength for a major counterattack. At approximately 3:30 in the morning, the attack began. Through the fog came a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives: the screaming of hundreds of Japanese soldiers charging out of the darkness. They came in waves, officers leading with raised swords, enlisted men following with bayonets fixed and rifles held like spears. Those without ammunition wielded their rifles as clubs. Some carried only grenades, intending to die taking Americans with them. Others had armed themselves with knives, sharpened sticks, anything that could kill. The American positions erupted in chaos. Sentries fired into the darkness at shapes materializing from the fog. Machine guns opened up, cutting down the leading ranks, but the charge never faltered. The Japanese trampled their own dead, screaming battle cries, driven by desperation and the absolute conviction that death in combat was preferable to any alternative. They crashed into the American foxholes like a human tsunami. The fighting that followed defied every expectation of modern warfare. Hand-to-hand combat erupted across the entire front line. Japanese soldiers leaped into foxholes with bayonets and swords. American troops fought back with rifle butts, knives, entrenching tools, and bare hands. Men grappled in the darkness, rolling in the mud, strangling and stabbing. The fog turned the battlefield into hundreds of individual death struggles, isolated combats where men fought enemies they could barely see. Gunfire became sporadic as ammunition ran out on both sides. The battle devolved into the most primitive form of combat humans have ever known: edged weapons and brute strength. Japanese officers cut down Americans with their katanas, the traditional swords proving devastatingly effective in the confined chaos of close combat. American troops grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Some seized Japanese swords from fallen enemies. Others fought with bayonets broken from rifles. The sound of steel on steel rang through the fog. The banzai charge had achieved complete tactical surprise, and in the first terrible minutes, the Japanese attackers overran multiple American positions. They swept through the medical tents near the beach, killing wounded men in their beds and slaughtering medical personnel. They captured artillery positions, but lacking ammunition for the guns, they simply killed the crews and moved on. The momentum of the charge carried them deep into American rear areas, creating panic and confusion throughout the defensive line. In the command post area, small groups of clerks, cooks, engineers, and wounded men who could still fight organized desperate resistance. These soldiers, many of whom had never fired a shot in combat, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against attackers who showed no interest in taking prisoners. Men armed themselves with whatever lay at hand. Kitchen knives became weapons. Tent poles became spears. And in the surreal violence of the moment, some Americans picked up fallen Japanese swords and used them against their original owners. One of the most intense confrontations occurred at the battalion aid station, where Medical Officer Captain Benjamin Davis and his staff fought to protect their patients. When Japanese soldiers burst into the tent complex, doctors and medics grabbed rifles and fought a room-by-room defense. The fighting inside the tents was particularly savage, with no space to maneuver and no possibility of retreat. Medical instruments became weapons. Wounded men who could stand joined the fight. The aid station became a slaughterhouse, blood mixing with medical supplies on the ground. But the Banzai charge, for all its initial shock and fury, carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The Japanese attackers had no ammunition reserves, limited weapons, and no possibility of reinforcement. They were fighting on the last reserves of strength and willpower, fueled by desperation rather than logistics. As the initial surge spent itself, American forces began to reorganize and counterattack. Machine gun crews who had survived the initial assault re-established their positions and began firing into the mass of attackers. Artillery batteries farther back began firing at point-blank range, turning their guns on the charging Japanese and firing canister rounds that cut down men in swathes. American reserves, initially confused by the chaos, began to move forward in coordinated groups, using superior numbers and firepower to contain and then compress the penetration. The nature of the combat remained brutally intimate. Even as American firepower began to tell, the fighting continued at arm's length. Japanese soldiers, knowing death was inevitable, sought to take as many enemies with them as possible. They fought until overwhelmed, until shot down, until hacked apart by entrenching tools and bayonets. Some, having lost all weapons, charged with bare hands, attempting to strangle or beat American soldiers to death before being killed themselves. As dawn broke through the fog, the full horror of the night's fighting became visible. Bodies lay everywhere, piled in foxholes, sprawled across the tundra, tangled together in death. The ground was slick with blood and mud. Broken weapons littered the battlefield, shattered rifles, bent bayonets, and scattered among them the distinctive curved blades of katanas, some still clutched in dead hands, others lying abandoned in the grass. Colonel Yamasaki had died leading his men, his sword in hand, his body found among the fallen near an American machine gun position. Of the 800 to 1,000 men who had launched the Banzai charge, virtually all were dead. Some had been killed in the initial assault. Others fell during the American counterattack. A handful, wounded and unable to continue fighting, took their own lives with grenades rather than face capture. When American troops cautiously advanced through the Japanese positions later that morning, they found scenes that would haunt them forever. Wounded Japanese soldiers who had committed suicide rather than surrender, some having formed small circles and detonated grenades among themselves. The American casualties from the Banzai charge and the night's fighting were severe. Estimates vary, but approximately 500 to 600 American soldiers were killed or wounded in the attack, many of them support personnel who had never expected to face close combat. The psychological impact on survivors was profound. Men who had fought through the entire campaign stated that nothing compared to the terror and savagery of that night, when the fog turned the battlefield into a nightmare realm where death came suddenly from the darkness with cold steel and screaming fury. The Battle of Attu officially ended on May 30, 1943, 19 days after it began. Of the approximately 2,500 Japanese defenders, only 28 were captured alive, most of them too severely wounded to commit suicide. The rest had died in combat or by their own hand. American casualties totaled nearly 3,700, 550 killed in action, 1,200 wounded, and nearly 2,000 disabled by cold injuries, disease, and psychological trauma. It was one of the costliest battles in the Pacific War when measured by casualty rates relative to forces engaged. The island itself stood as testament to the battle's brutality. Burial details worked for weeks to inter the dead in the frozen ground. Equipment lay abandoned across the tundra, trucks sunk to their axles in muskeg, artillery pieces bogged in mud, supplies scattered and ruined. The Japanese tunnel systems and bunkers remained as monuments to defensive ingenuity, their walls still marked with the carbon scoring of flamethrowers and the blood of their defenders. For the American military, Attu provided harsh lessons that would shape future operations. The gross underestimation of enemy strength and resolve led to a complete overhaul of intelligence procedures. The inadequate preparation for Arctic warfare resulted in new training programs and specialized equipment for troops. The psychological impact of the banzai charge led to changes in how troops were prepared for the fanatical resistance they would face throughout the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. The Japanese lesson from Attu was equally stark. The absolute prohibition against surrender, the requirement to fight to the last man, had resulted in the virtual annihilation of the garrison with minimal strategic gain. Yet rather than question this doctrine, Japanese military leadership doubled down on it, making the defense of subsequent islands even more suicidal and ensuring that battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa would replicate Attu's savagery on vastly larger scales. The subsequent invasion of Kiska, planned for August 1943, revealed an ironic coda to the Aleutian campaign. The Japanese, having learned from Attu's fate and recognizing they could not adequately defend or resupply the island, executed a brilliant withdrawal under cover of fog, evacuating the entire garrison without American forces detecting the operation. When 35,000 American and Canadian troops landed on Kiska, they found an abandoned island. In the resulting confusion and fog, Allied forces suffered casualties from friendly fire and booby traps, but faced no enemy. The Japanese had achieved through cunning what they had refused to attempt at Attu: survival. For the soldiers who fought on Attu, the experience left permanent scars. Many struggled with what today would be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of hand-to-hand combat in the fog, of fighting with medieval weapons in a modern war, of the screaming charges emerging from darkness. The battle received little public attention compared to campaigns in Europe or the South Pacific, making Attu the forgotten battle of a forgotten front, despite its extraordinary cost and savagery. The use of swords and bayonets in close combat at Attu represented both an anomaly and a reminder. It was an anomaly because the specific conditions of terrain, weather, and tactical situation created circumstances where modern weapons failed and combat reverted to its most ancient forms. But it was also a reminder that beneath all the technology and firepower, war remains fundamentally about human beings and extremists, fighting and dying according to logic that transcends eras and equipment. Today, the Aleutian Islands remain remote and largely uninhabited. The battlefield at Attu is accessible only by special permission, the island now designated as a National Historic Landmark. The rusted remains of equipment still dot the landscape. The graves of the fallen overlook the same fog-shrouded valleys where they fought. And in the silence of that windswept place, one can still sense the presence of those who fought there, Americans and Japanese alike, locked in a battle that brought the medieval and the modern into terrible collision, proving that even in the age of total war, victory could still come down to the edge of a blade and the courage to wield it in the face of death. The lessons of Attu echo across the decades. That terrain and weather can neutralize technological advantage. That human will can overcome devastating odds. That cultural values shape how men fight and die. And that war, regardless of the era or the weapons employed, ultimately reduces to the same fundamental equation: individuals facing mortality, making impossible choices, and discovering in themselves capacities for both extraordinary violence and extraordinary courage that peacetime could never reveal.